My name is Carl Marci, and this is Peter Leimbach, and I'm going to start with three quick notes. The first one, for those of you from outside of the U.S., we're going to be talking about football. This is the kind with helmets and high scores. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about how this morning we heard about the interaction between self-report and some of these neuroscience measures. And I think that, I hope that one of the takeaways from this talk is how if we had relied exclusively on talking to people, we would have gone to a very different, and I think very erroneous conclusion. And I think third, I want to really thank Peter Leimbach for not only doing the work, but for being willing to stand up and talk about it. Because I think that you all know that without clients who are willing to take that first step and embrace new technology, the field won't advance. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So just a quick overview of what we're going to walk through. Peter's actually going to talk about what is double box advertising and show you an example, and then walk through a little bit of the evolution of that advertising, sort of where we've been and where we are. And then I'm going to walk through one example with some highlights that really illustrate a program of research that's been going on for almost 2 years. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the implications and best practices of that. And then Peter's going to talk about sort of how this has landed and where we go from here. So with that,
We're going to start the show and tell, though, with the show part. To set up the double box, give you a good sense of what this execution looks like. This is going to be an example of a Dr. Pepper ad that ran in one of our college football bowl games on Fox broadcast network. What you're going to see is predominantly the left and center part of the screen, upper part of the screen, will be the main ad itself. Over on the right, upper right-hand side, will be a smaller box, which is the live content window. So what happens is when the football game came to a timeout, we went to a commercial break. And we stayed with the cameras on the sidelines of one of the teams to give sports fans a feeling like you're not leaving the game. And that was one of our goals with Double Box, was to give sports fans something a little bit more. So don't just go to a commercial break and leave me out of touch with what's happening in the stadium. Make me feel like I'm still there and I'm still part of the game. Plus, we want to try to keep them there rather than having them, change the channel or their attention divert somewhere else. The third part that you're going to see, and it's essentially a backwards L, which we consider the wrap, is a place where the advertiser, as far as their creativity and what we can do from a technological standpoint, can take them. You'll see a pretty interesting execution of the Dr. Pepper brand and the can itself animated within that wrap area. So, the presentation is titled Viewer Choice. I encourage you to take your choice of looking around all three areas of the screen, and if we could put eye tracking on everybody, that would be great to see where everybody's attention was going. Ready? Take it away.
Ladies, why is your man watching this snoozer of a game? Because I'm on his fantasy football team. So he gets for 10 points if we win or not. It's a guy thing. Like Dr. Pepper 10, with all 23 flavors of Dr. Pepper and just 10 barely calories, it's like a fantasy soda, but you can drink it. It's what guys want. Like scoring touchdowns with players that fit culture. Woo! So close. So keep the reality TV and lady drinks for good.
Dr. Pepper 10, it's not for women.
So how do we get to that from what initially started as we had two challenges. One, we wanted to make sure that we're going to serve sports fans, and we want to make sure that they would stay during commercial breaks. Obviously, that's the currency of the television business is getting advertisers to pay for commercial time and then delivering an audience to them. So we want to serve the fans, but we also want to serve the advertiser in making sure that their message is going to be able to get through, and having viewers there is the first challenge to getting by that. So the initial iteration of any kind of side-by-side, which is what it used to be called, started with motorsports. It was a natural where there's a sport with continuous action, but you can't stay there for the entire race because you got to pay the bills, you got to go to the commercial break. So this was an example on the left of the initial iteration of side-by-side, where the ad on the left was almost the same size as the content box on the right. And not only was Fox Sports doing this, but I also used to work at ESPN, and we were doing it within NASCAR and IndyCar racing, and research that I had been involved in at Disney's Media and Ad Lab in Texas showed that there was probably too much given to the content box and maybe not enough attention on the ads, and maybe this format wasn't exactly the best to be beneficial to the advertiser. And we have to consider them first while we're considering serving sports fans. So the new iteration, it was exciting for me when I came to Fox Sports about a year and a half ago that I saw this new design that they were coming out with, much more dynamic, much greater opportunity for the advertiser to put their brand and in a very dynamic way in the wrap. And then the next thing was, you know what, we don't have to just limit ourselves to motorsports. We can actually, do this in other live sports where, again, we're keeping the fan in touch with what's going on in the arena or in the stadium. So that's the new, current double box with the wrap, with the dynamic element, as you saw in the video with the can rotating. So, to Carl's point earlier, this is a program that's gone back to June 2011, which was a study of the first iteration of side-by-side, which we saw on the previous screen. So then the thought becomes, can we do this with other live sports? And hey, why not? Let's test it. And it was in a controlled environment, so people were watching plausibly live sports in that environment, where we included college football, again, the one with the hands and not so much the feet. Major League Baseball, UFC, which is mixed martial arts fighting, and UEFA, which is Champions League soccer. And those tests went very well. So the next iteration, we figured, let's do this live. Let's take a shot and see how we could do this in a live event. And the big event that we had coming up on our calendar was the AT&T Cotton Bowl, which was January of 2013. It was a big event. It had Johnny Football, for those of you, Johnny Manziel, who's leaving Texas A&M to come into the NFL next year. So a big event. We knew we'd have a big audience and a lot of interest in the game. So we did a live test of double box where we worked with Interscope to actually measure their response to the ads. And then following that, shortly after, we also did tests of live UFC and the Daytona 500. And all of this was leading up to the events that we had done previously, and the events that we had that we could test were on the Fox Broadcast Network, which we share with the entertainment folks. So it wasn't full-time sports. But we were in the throes of actually launching a 24/7 sports network, which we did this past August, Fox Sports 1. And one of our tentpoles to this new network was the opportunity that we were going to afford to advertisers to execute on double box in all of our live sporting events. So we needed, as much positive findings and valuable insights that we could garner. And that's why, we came to Interscope and we posed these questions. And of course, as Carl mentioned from the outset, very difficult to get people to tell you, how they're going to react to something like that, because certainly, as we know, what people say they do and what they actually do are often two different things. And without the techniques that Interscope brought to us, there's no way we would have had accurate insights into how effective these executions were. So the questions we brought forth were, how do viewers emotionally engage full screen ads versus the double box ads? Is there some kind of difference when the screen's being shared with program content and a wrap around those ads? And how does the visual attention change, again, from a full screen ad to a double box ad? The common wisdom amongst advertisers when we tell them, well, you're going to share the screen with some live content, and that's a big pushback of, okay, so all the attention's now going to end up on that live sporting event. I'm paying you for 100% of the screen, and you're taking part of my screen away, and you're probably taking all the attention away as well. So we wanted to make sure that we could measure that accurately, and really what we knew what we believed going in was that that wouldn't be the case, that people wouldn't be focused just on that program content. And then finally, what else could we learn in terms of best practices for our advertisers, for the industry, and for ourselves, in how we could make this more effective and a great viewing experience for the fans and a positive advertising environment for our advertising partners going forward.
So the business question is, how do you keep eyes on the screen, give them a little bit of entertainment, but not take away from the advertising?
Absolutely.
So, like I said, we're going to highlight one of multiple tests that we did, and this is with the Cotton Bowl. Just to give you a sample of who we recruited and how we set it up. We had about 60 people, 39 biometrics, 16 eye tracking. We had done multiple studies like this before. And so I know there's a lot of talk about sample size. It's called a power analysis. We knew the effect we were going for. We knew how many people we needed. We had no issue with this sample size going into a live study. 18 to 49-year-olds, fairly broad for us. We tend to like a narrow range, but again, this is a large effect that we're going after. You see the household income, and that they must have watched some college football, particularly on a regular basis. Interestingly, we were in 2 cities. So we did the Biometrics live. We wanted to be close to the game. So we went to Dallas, and we were in a hotel there doing the live event with the Biometrics. And then because of eye tracking, and we used Tobii eye trackers, and this was actually fairly complicated. We had, at one point, up to 18 eye trackers wired up with a single cable, a live feed going into it while people watched the game. And so that's actually technically a real challenge, but it gave us these amazing insights. And importantly, we only analyzed the first half of the game because not every pod has the double box. In this case, it was 1 pod.
First break of the first quarter, first break of the second quarter. Yeah, I should have mentioned that. You can't do it every break. It would start to be monotonous.
Okay, so what are the tools we used? Hopefully by now everyone's seen our booklet and our brochure. Interscope is an integrated consumer neuroscience research firm. What does that mean? That means that we take multiple tools and we integrate those channels in a thoughtful way to provide solutions to all kinds of business questions. We started out in 2006 using medical grade heart rate, skin conductivity, respiration, motion. We very quickly integrated Tobii eye trackers into our portfolio, and about 2 years ago started playing around with and seriously evaluating facial coding. And this year we're actively pursuing implicit measures, and we did our first fMRI study. So we're very excited about bringing all of these tools to bear for our clients. In this particular study, we focused on our core biometrics. Again, medical grade heart rate, skin sweat, respiration and motion. We use a biometric belt that does have to make connection to the skin, goes under your shirt, and virtually disappears. So people can very comfortably sit through several hours of programming. As I mentioned, we did eye tracking as a separate event in this case. Often we'll do eye tracking and biometrics on the same person. In this case, it was a separate event because you do have to actually set these eye trackers up, and people want to be staring at the screen. And then finally, and most importantly, we did talk to people. Because we did want to get some of their top-of-mind attitudes and look to see if what they were saying was really matching up with what they were experiencing. One of the terms I'm also going to use today is emotional engagement. And we know we heard this term earlier today. I'm very pleased when people use it and then define it, because it's one of these terms in the industry that a lot of people use but don't always define. For us, an engagement is attention to something that emotionally moves you. The example I always use, if I take a sip of this water and I put it down, we all agree that I'm paying attention to it. But am I really engaged with it? Now, if I take a sip of that water and I spill it on my suit, or I spill it on my computer, with all due respect to you, I'm going to run and grab a towel and I'm going to wipe it down. I'm going to hope my computer's okay. I'm going to have a large emotional response to that. Which one do you think I'm going to remember 2 weeks from now? Emotions tag information for relevance. It's that combination of those two things that allow us to measure engagement. And we're doing this using algorithms that combine a measure of synchrony, which is are these channels moving at the same time at the same rate, with intensity. How big a response are we getting? And it was interesting to hear some of the talks this morning about the low attention version of processing. And I know that's also a tricky word, but think of synchrony not as arousal. It's just, are you going on a common journey? And the intensity portion is really arousal. Now, this is a metric that's been very well validated over the years. It's not the point of this talk to talk about validation. I can give you 3 quick examples. We've used it with high correlations to set-top box data. In other words, people are more likely to watch ads that they're highly engaged with. We've also published studies showing that high levels of engagement correlate with high numbers of views and comments following the Super Bowl. And thirdly, we have shown high correlations to high levels of engagement and opening weekend box office receipts. Quite simply, what people watch, what they will talk about, and what they will buy. For the purpose of this discussion, high engagement is better than low engagement. Okay, what do we find? We're going to organize our findings around 4 buckets. The first one is attention to advertising in double box was surprisingly high. The second one, double box advertising was actually more engaging than traditional advertising. We're going to talk about what that means and why that might be. Double box advertising also, a little bit surprisingly, was more immune to traditional shortcomings. So we're going to talk about the position in the pod and ad wear out. And then finally, this wrap that Peter alluded to, when it's dynamic, had extra properties that allowed viewers to engage with the brand even more than in a traditional ad pod. So let's break down those findings a little bit. Finding number one, attention to advertising in the double box was surprisingly high. The vast majority of visual attention during double box advertising is on the sponsored elements.
Thanks for proving our theory.
Surprisingly, when you give viewers a choice, you can watch content from the game that you wanted to go watch, or you can watch advertising. The vast majority of the time, in this particular layout, people watch the ads. On average, only 3 times during a single commercial would people even glance over at the content.
And I would just say part of that is, there's no audio on the content. And we're not, the game's not going on. So there's just things that are happening peripherally to the field. I think it makes it, a little less engaging, but it keeps me from tuning out.
So let's see an example from the eye tracking. This is aggregated eye tracking for those not familiar with the video heat map. This is moving fixation density. On the left, you're going to see what it looks like in full screen. On the right, you're going to see the same ad in a double box format. Take a look, particularly in the double box, where the eyes are relative to the extra content. Now, I mentioned self-report. So this is obviously a quote from a qualitative. This is Judy. I should have also mentioned that we did test males and females. It was a mixed audience. And Judy's quote was, "Double box was a great way to keep me in tune with the game. I didn't watch any ads because I was so involved with the game and the content." Now, this is exactly what you would expect. Well, let's look at Judy's eye tracking. This is now, instead of that aggregated scene, you're going to see a red dot. And that red dot represents where her eyes are at the moment.
Taylor, I got someone I want you to meet.
Hello, AT&T, the nation's largest 4G network, covering 3,000 more 4G cities and towns than Verizon. Rethink possible.
Customer Aaron Swenson bought from us online today, so I'm happy. Sales go up, I'm happy.
It went out today. I'm happy.
What if she's not at home? She won't be happy.
Use UPS. She can get a text alert, reroute, even reschedule a package. It's UPS My Choice.
You happy?
I'm happy.
I'm happy.
I'm happy. I'm happy.
I'm happy.
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 Happy. I love logistics.
You get the point.
Busted, Judy.
And it's not that Judy was lying. I actually think she believed that she was watching the content. And that this is something that we just naturally do, given a choice. And it's not something she has access to. Finding number 2. Double box advertising was more engaging than traditional advertising. This is not something we expected. Although double box audiences typically glance at the content window only 3 times during a typical spot, those viewing the double box ads also maintain very high emotional engagement for the ad for 50% longer. Secondly, the engagement is highest when attention to the ad was highest. And this gave us a sense that it was actually the content of the ad, the creative, that was driving that stronger response. Now, one way to put this into context and just to measure it, looking at overall engagement with the pod, when we look at the pod preceding the double box pod, or the ad pod that featured the double box ads, versus the pod following, we saw a 13% increase overall for the pod. Now, what about an individual ad? Just as an example of what's driving that effect, here we see the AT&T ad you just saw. We're going to show that again in a minute. And what you see is in the full screen environment, this ad starts off highly engaging. There's a big dip, a little bit of a rise in the branding moment. And in contrast, when it's in the double box, that middle period keeps a high level of engagement. What we think is going on is giving people the choice, allowing them to search and look around actually stimulates their emotional engagement. Now, going back to self-report for a minute, What's also interesting is that despite reporting that it did not change their behavior, audiences self-reported higher enjoyment with the double box. 71% of people reported that they feel better about watching the game in the double box environment. Some quotes from an individual respondent male. It's easier to remember the brand because the logo is on screen the whole time. I also like the fact that we never left the game. A female responded. I could still see what was going on with the game. I really liked that feature. And another male responded, I love it. Great way to stay in tune with the game, sort of like picture-in-a-picture or watching the game at a sports bar on several occasions. So it appears that we're starting to see a win-win.
Yeah, and that obviously was one of the goals, as I mentioned, is we want to serve the fans, give them something a little bit extra, and it's very rewarding to see those kind of comments come back that we're hitting on the right note.
Finding number 3, double box advertising was shown to be immune to traditional shortcomings. What do we mean by that? Well, by providing this impression of choice or actual choice, double boxing actually minimized drops in engagement, making all positions in the pod more equally valuable. And repeated ads benefited from exposure in the double box, minimizing wear out. So let's break that down a little bit. When you look at these middle ads, what we know from Biometrics, but we also know from set-top box ratings data, that as advertising unfolds within a pod, viewership drops and emotional engagement tends to drop. Ads in the middle tend to suffer from that position. What we found, interestingly, during the double box pods, again, we had that lift, that little bit of a pop, and all ads were sort of being more and more sort of on a level playing field. Now that's pod position. What about wear out? So lots of studies have been done and shown that when you habitually show a stimulus to people, humans' emotions tend to decrease over time. And that habituation is well documented. Well, it turns out in the double box environment, you can actually attenuate some of that habituation. So some examples here, 2 ads, UPS and AT&T, shown in full screen first and then in double box, we actually saw an increase in engagement. There was an ad for Subway that started in double box, then went full screen. Again, an increase in engagement, almost like a priming effect. And then there was one ad for Dr. Pepper that was actually shown twice in the double box. The second time actually had a higher level of engagement. And in only one case did the second exposure decrease in engagement, and that is when you went full screen first and then full screen second. Finding number 4. Now we get to the wrap, that part around the 2 screens. Dynamic wraps provide more opportunities to engage with the brand. These dynamic wraps got 50% more attention, and when you do a drive-by, meaning if there's some movement in that wrap, they generated twice as much attention. And then advertising logos, these branding moments in the ads, were viewed for an identical length of time, whether they were in the double box or the full screen. Meaning, take the wrap out of the picture, branding was getting about the same amount. And this makes sense because you saw there was a high amount of visual attention in these ads. When you include the wrap and the number of fixations on the brand within that wrap, now the advertising logos in the double box get 3.5 times higher the level of visual attention. And that's got to have extra
And these were critical findings for us because not only do we have to undertake that effort of creating the wrap in collaboration with the advertiser, but we wanted to get a different look and feel to the double box execution than the original side-by-side. And these findings showed us that we were going in the right direction.
Just to break that down a little bit, for example, when you look at dynamic wraps, these are the ads that had that extra movement. We had a 50% lift when you added that movement in terms of number of fixations on the brand. And then these drive-by features, again, almost double the level of visual attention. That's a huge effect when it comes to eye tracking and visual attention to the brand. Now, one other nuance to this was, what about the content in the ad, and could we get some synergy out of it? I played the AT&T ad earlier. It was a little hard to see. Hopefully this will work because we're having a little problems with the video up here today. But watch this ad. What's important to this ad is that this high school football player does a very acrobatic move in the beginning, and he starts to then share it with his friends, and that sharing sort of moves forward. But also watch the wrap and how it moves, and then finally take a look at the second screen and then the game at the end and see if you notice any characters that are familiar.
Are you kidding me? Mr. Woodson?
Caleb, I got someone I want you to meet.
Hello, AT&T, the nation's largest 4G network, covering 3,000 more 4G cities and towns than Verizon. Rethink possible.
So, did you notice what happened there? So we're watching this ad for AT&T, and we're seeing Bob Stoops, very popular coach for Oklahoma Sooners, and all of a sudden he shows up in the game. Now, that seems like a kind of contextual synergy.
It was fortuitous, the way it worked out.
And what we see is there's a lot of visual attention, again, going back and forth, but we know from other research that's actually been published that contextual relevance matters. That people will get an extra boost in engagement, and they will feel that pleasure, that liking that they reported about what they got even more when this occurs. So taking these 4 findings, one of the research objectives, as you heard at the beginning, was, could we provide some best practices? So what we did is we looked across all of the different studies we did with an effort to guide Fox Sports and ultimately Fox Television and others thinking about double box, what exactly are the best practices? And this is what we came up with. When you're talking about the double box, use double box intermittently. Can't do it every time.
No.
Not every pod should be a double box pod. Secondly, as you just saw, context matters. To the extent that's possible, utilize athletes and contextual characters in order to boost emotional engagement. Thirdly, move it or lose it. Dynamic wraps lead to significantly higher levels of visual attention. To the extent possible, bring in movement. We know the brain loves novelty, we heard that this morning, and movement is a kind of novelty, particularly in a wrap situation. And then finally, keep them guessing. Repeat views, direct attention to the wrap, and consider changing what's on the wrap. So one of the nice things about the wrap is it's a creative element that you can actually change over time to enhance novelty. And then in terms of the content for the double box, and this is really important, and in a moment we'll hear why, but when you're producing that content, keep things interesting, but not too interesting. Minimize action and movement, minimize showing star players, and we recommended no cheerleaders. Use wide shots, people in helmets. You saw during that AT&T ad, we saw a lot of the back of Coach Bob Stoops. And that was actually on purpose, and that came out of one of the best practices because we didn't want to draw people to people's faces, because as we just heard a moment ago, there's an area of the brain called the fusiform gyrus that's dedicated to facial processing, and when people see faces, they're tempted to look at it, particularly celebrities. And then finally, occasionally, show something new and unique. Exclusive shots, close-ups, intimate behind-the-scenes moments can serve as hooks for added value. So the point is, you don't want to be too boring, but you also don't want to be too engaging. And that really is a balance that people have to strike.
Absolutely. So the implications for our advertising partners, as we drew out of these research insights, viewer choice, and what this was all about, really resulted in increasing emotional engagement for the brands in the double box format. And again, we're taking away some of their screens, so they don't get 100% of the screen, but what we're increasing is the value of the effectiveness of the ad itself. Double box brings value to advertisers by improving the overall pod engagement. We've known for years that if you've got that middle position in a pod, that's the low point in how ratings track, either second by second or minute by minute. But now, when we see middle ads having the same level of attention and emotional engagement as ads on either end of the pod, that's an increased value, not only to the advertiser, but to us as well, keeping viewers tuned in. And then double box providing an opportunity to glance at that second window. As much as our advertiser partners would love to believe that their 30 seconds are the most engaging 30 seconds that have ever been put on television, there's going to be moments in any ad where maybe some attention can be distracted to somewhere else. But rather than have that viewer be tuned out altogether, there is some place else for their attention to go, if only momentarily, and then back to the ad. So we feel that doing the double box provides that opportunity to keep that viewer at least on the screen. It's not going to go away. Maybe the attention is diverted, but only momentarily. And then ultimately, the dynamic elements that are the new and unique part of the double box execution can increase the level of attention to the double box ads. And it really is a unique opportunity that can go as far as the advertiser wants to take it, and as far as we can implement it from a technological and creative standpoint.